Hello, everybody. We continue in our tour of the High Holidays with our guide Maimonides, who Maimonides always has answers. He's, I wonder if he was a fun person to hang out with because he just knew everything. So he always has an answer. And not only did he know everything, but he believed that everything was possible to know. That's, I think, fundamental to his orientation, is that this tradition can be understood and all of the big questions have answers. So let's start asking some big questions, okay? Let's just start. And we have like a screen here. I encourage you to select the not the speaker view, what's the other view? The many, so you can see everybody here. Let's just do start with hands. Who here thinks that they are a good person? Just gonna leave it at that. Good person? Most people. Okay. Who thinks that they know a truly good person? They know someone who is definitely a good person. Okay, that's almost everyone, but okay. Who here thinks that they are a bad person? Just fundamentally bad person. And this is a totally safe space to share that, of course. But I'm not seeing any hands. Okay. Now, who thinks that they know a truly wicked person? Let me see some. It's a little easier to do this these days, right? Like you say, one name pops to a lot of our minds. Okay, fine. But okay, less hands. Let me just see that again. Who thinks they know a truly wicked person? Okay, not as many. Okay, that's already a question. We have to think about that. Why do so many of us tend to regard ourselves as good people? I would probably say the same, good person. And fewer of us would say that we are bad people. And similarly, we have a sense, oh, there are good people, or to put it in a language we're going to use tonight, righteous people in the world. But it's harder to say that I know some wicked people. Some of you did not say that. And I wonder, in a different, administration, whether so many of you would have said, oh, I can think of someone, right? So let me just ask one last question before we get into Maimonides. Who here thinks that there's no such thing as a bad or a good person? That's like, the question doesn't make any sense. Matt says no. So Matt, can I ask you to respond a little? Why not?
I think that everybody has moments, either way.
Good, okay. That's a great answer, because I think what you're saying is the question suggests that a good person is just good all the time, and a bad person is bad all the time, and there's just no way. I just don't believe that everyone's always bad or that everyone's always good, okay? Anybody want to respond to that? And Shia?
I would say someone is a good person when they choose to do good things more than they choose to do bad things, like have a higher balance of good things versus bad things.
Okay, so that's a good response. Like, oh no, when we talk about good people or bad people, righteous or wicked people, just to make it stronger, well, yeah, Matt's right. There's all good, all bad. That seems nearly impossible. But although, let's be clear, we often speak of, the saints as if they were all good, and we speak of, it's always Hitler was all bad, right? Like nobody's like, oh, but he was really nice to his, cat. So we speak of it this way, but then she is saying, like, what we're talking about is on balance, on the whole. Like, what's the general thrust of this person's what? That's part of the question. Their intentions, their behavior. Okay, Liz, you want to jump in?
I think it's, for some people, it's really clear the guiding principles by which they live their life. And while they're human and they err and do things contrary to those principles, it's pretty clear that, and I think most of us fall in the middle somewhere, but there are these righteous, good people that you see how they live their life and they make choices consistently with those principles, or on the contrary, they don't. They go for the bad. They go for the greedy. They go for, so I don't think the whole world divides into good and evil. I think most of us are in the middle, but I do think those moral principles are pretty recognizable when you see them in somebody.
Okay, that's really helpful, both because of the way that you are, you're describing it as what guiding principles lead your life. That's one way of thinking about it, but also in that you actually give us an important third category. When you say most of us are somewhere in the middle, right? The middle is a category unto itself. I think I don't pay much attention to the chat. I can never go back and forth. I think I saw someone just say, Jennifer said that the Tanya, the Hasidic work by the founder of the Chabad movement, says that there are 5 types. Let's hold, Jennifer, let's hold that because we'll get back to that earlier. But right now we're at 3 types, and Liz has given us the 3rd type, which is those of us in the middle. And Liz says, we do have a sense that some people, okay, maybe they're not perfect, but they really seem to be living their lives mostly along the lines of their highest values. And we also have a sense that some people, it's just like, I guess they might have some redeeming quality, but just most of what they do is just self-interested and horrible and destructive, right? Like so we have some sense of these categories. Okay, so that's great. Little bit of a disagreement over like exactly, not disagreement, but different language that has been given for exactly how we would both categorize and qualify what it meant to be a good person. But we're in murky territory. It's hard to say how we would know such a thing, how one would make that determination. And some of us are saying, I'm not sure I'm even comfortable with the idea of a good person or a bad person. That's an oversimplification, right? Okay. So let's see what Mr. Know-it-all says, right? Because Maimonides definitely has a scheme for us. And I will tell you as we head into this that we're going to look at 4 halachot, they call them, as if they were laws, but they're really like 4 paragraphs, 4 teachings that I think I've recommended this work to you as the work that is the must read of the High Holidays. Well, I would say that what we're going to look at tonight is my favorite part. This is like, to me, this is like in the most important reading of the High Holidays. This moment is the most weighty and dramatic. In fact, I do remember that last year I was talking to Rabbi Brous about what I would do for my sermon. She sort of coaches me through my Rosh Hashanah sermon, and I was very excited. I came into her office and I said, "Look at this Rambam. Look at this. This is what I'm going to do for my sermon." And she looks it over and she's like, "Yeah, that's great. What are you going to say?" And I was like, I'm just gonna read it. She's like, "Okay, you go back and work on that a little bit." So, but like I had this thought, like I didn't actually have anything to say, and I'm not sure I do tonight, but I just want you to read through this because Maimonides is gonna put out some walloping concepts that I don't think we're all going to agree with, but I think they force us to have a real reckoning with these questions, which should be on our minds during this period of preparation for the holidays, because maybe we can't become righteous, or maybe we won't become totally wicked, but we are trying to become, dare I say, a little better, right? So these reference points are important. Okay, let's now, I'm going to share with you the source sheet that we're going to use tonight, in case you want to take a look at it on the side. And as usual, I'll head into it. So I just shared it in the chat. Okay, let me make sure I'm in the right place. Here we go. Okay, we get a lot in the very first moment here. We get the whole system in a sense just in these first few lines. So we're going to spend a lot of our time analyzing this. Okay, so chapter 3 of Mishneh Torah. Chapter 1, if you'll recall, we dealt with confession and the centrality of confession. Chapter 2, we tried to come up with a definition of tshuva. What does it mean? How does it work? How do we do it? Okay. But now the question is really, how do we evaluate where we're at? How do we take stock? So we're supposed to be doing this cheshbon hanefesh, this accounting of the soul. So how do we do that? Okay. Here he goes. Kol echad ve'echad mibnei adam yesh lo zchuyot va'avanot. Okay, this is a strong statement right at the outset. Each and every human being has merits and sins. Who's right? Matt's right. That's what Matt said. Every person is a mix. And the Rambam, I have to say, I don't know if I would have expected him to say that. What about the totally righteous person? But that's not what he says. And he's so emphatic here. Listen, look at the Hebrew. Kol echad ve'echad mibnei adam. Every one of the children of Adam has merits and sins. I don't know. I want to just say that the words here, just for those tracking the Hebrew, are zchuyot and avonot, which I've translated as merits and sins. It's like, in the original translation, it was virtues and vices. You could say good deeds and bad deeds. A little hard to, but credit and sin, like positive and negative on your record. Okay? So every single person has merits and sins. That's a statement. Okay? That's like, I could already stop here and ask you if you agree with that or not. But, and by the way, let me just to complete that thought, it's not so, it sounds like an easy proposition to accept, but is it true? I mean, does a child have sins, right? Like, do the saints and the Hitlers of the world have the other quality? Like, we could think about that a little bit, but maybe so. Okay. And now is his definition. As like, I'm like being so slow here in part because I don't want to, like, this is it. We're going to get to it. One whose merits exceed one's sins is a righteous person. And the language here is so strong, that's a tzaddik. That's the word we use for a saint, for a perfectly righteous person. Tzaddik. And one whose sins exceed one's merits is a wicked person, a rasha, also a very strong word. Mechza lemechza, if you have half-half, then you're a Benoni, an average person, a middle person. Okay, so let's just stop there because that's already saying quite a lot. And I'm like, on the one hand, it includes the complexity that Matt suggested, that we're all made up of all these different qualities. But what a strange and strangely precise schema here. If you have 51 good deeds and 49 bad deeds, you're a tzaddik, you're a righteous person. And if you have 51 sins and 49 good deeds, you are a wicked person. And only if you have 50-50 are you in the middle. It's just like, who even cares? Okay? All right. The Tanya that Jennifer wrote in the chat becomes actually immediately relevant here because it's a response to this, but we'll hold off on that for a second. Let's first just hear your thoughts on this. Does this make sense? Is this true in some way? What do you think he means by it, that 51% merits makes you a tzaddik, a righteous person? Okay? 51% sins, you're going to hell, right? Like, I mean, I'm overstating it, but you're a wicked person. What do you think? Does that, yeah, let's see, Tali and then Anthony. Tali, you out there? I have a hand raised, yeah.
So I think what it's saying is that the 50% is, it's that balance, a leveling. Once you go to the 51%, it's that you're elevating yourself. So it's almost as if that you've gone beyond that. Most of our life is, most people are in this category of balance. So once you go into that 50%, 51, it's as if to say, and I'm giving the credit, that it will go higher. That somehow you've sort of passed that level that maybe you've been leveled, that you are going to continue to go higher. And then once you go down, the greater likelihood of going down that you may continue to go down.
That's a really interesting theory. I like that. That in a sense, we're in a kind of a balancing act. And the idea is that if you can muster a majority of sins, then there's a sense in which like your life is headed in that direction of righteousness. And good enough. That's what we're looking for, is a propensity, a tendency, okay? And, you know, and to avoid the opposite. So it really is this kind of like, you could tip over at any moment. So I like that theory. Anthony.
Well, I agree with what Pally said, because what I was thinking was the pure mathematical formula can't work, because you have to assess the magnitude of your good and bad deeds. I mean, stealing a loaf of bread or something, any small misdeed is not the same as a murder, and so on and so forth. So it will be very complex to do it mathematically. So the idea of a propensity or leaning towards a majority of good or leaning towards a majority of bad makes more sense to me.
Okay, I'm always impressed by the intuitive powers of this group, and Anthony is Baruch Shekivanta is already a little bit ahead of us. Maimonides will have to follow up with the question that Anthony is raising, like, what does it mean 50-50? Like, different sins and different good deeds are different. Like, if I, you know, donate a quarter 50 times, but murder someone 50 times, that's not half-half. Right? That's not how, okay. So yeah, so this is like, it gets complicated very quickly. Jacob, or I'm not sure if it's Jacob or Sophia that's raising your hand.
Okay, actually me.
Hi.
I guess I'm confused about what about if it's in a different sort of regime. So say you're awful to your children and your other family members, but you're in, like, to the rest of the world, a pretty righteous person, then to your family members, it seems incorrect to say that you're a righteous person, even though to people outside your family, maybe it would be accurate to say you're a righteous person, or maybe it's the case that so it seems like it matters to whom you are righteous if you are to be considered righteous from that group of people.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. That sounds to me, unless I'm misunderstanding you, that's a different and actually very sophisticated, a different scheme that you're giving us, which is that when we sit and recognize that we have all kinds of different behaviors, then we also have to recognize that our goodness, our righteousness, our wickedness is actually different based on the moment, the behavior we're engaged in, and the context. I may be a very righteous rabbi, but a crappy friend, right? So, like, as far as my friend is concerned, I'm a rasha, I'm a wicked person, but my whole congregation thinks that I'm such a righteous rabbi, right? So, which suggests to me, I mean, the complexity, I think you're saying, suggests that it isn't, you can't actually weigh one against the other. It looks quite different depending on who's looking and what their impression is. And then I suppose you can begin to talk about, well, I'm 51% a righteous rabbi, or I'm 49, you know. But I think you've also, Sophia, offered a new scheme that I think is important to keep in mind. Okay. All right. Let's take just another comment or two, and then I want to move forward. Bob?
Yeah, so reading this again, I don't think he's making the suggestion that every sin and every merit counts as one. I think he's like saying collectively your merits and your sins. So I take this to mean that, yeah, you could, you know, be a good person, and all your merits add up, but you do one really bad sin like murder someone, and that would count as much as all of the little merits that you got. So I agree with like the 50-50, but how you get to that 50-50, I think could be very open to interpretation.
Okay. You know what? I'm like, I sometimes I try to hold the reins on the ordering of the text, but I think having once again gotten to this place where we're really starting to think about, well, what about the quality of sins? Like, what is actually, how do we weigh out these things? I want to jump. We're going to come back, but I want to jump forward to the next law here, because this is where Anthony was going before and where Bob is taking us now, which is to really consider not just, it's not a mathematical formula, like what did you do and how significant was it? So the Rambam here has two important caveats. One, I think, especially important, but the first one addresses exactly the concerns that are being raised right now. So he hastens to say, right, having said that it seemed like, oh, 50 of this and 50 of that, he says, but wait a minute, the weighing of all this is not according to the number of merits and sins, but according to their magnitude. Okay, I see Anthony shaking his head. Yes, that's right. That has to be true. There are merits that outweigh many sins. Like you did many sins, but you did such a good thing. And he quotes a verse, because in him there is found some good thing, so that person will be redeemed. V'yesh, and there are sins which outweigh many merits, as it says, and he has another proof text for that. Okay, so that's he is acknowledging a truth that you have already articulated. That okay, yes, there's a balancing act, but it isn't actually as complicated as it isn't actually as simple as counting them up. It's a complex system where the magnitude and the number and all of, like, it's like, but there is some sense that there's like a scale, right? Like a balancing, and maybe one big weighty sin is going to throw you off, right? So let me just, now that we're in this, let me give the other major caveat. And to me, this is such an important moment in this teaching, where the Rambam is really, as I said, acting as if, oh, it could all be figured out and everybody, just count them up. But now we're suggesting, oh, but it's not quite that simple. And then he says the thing which I really want him to say, which is, Ve'ein shoklin el badato shel el deot v'hu yodea heich orchin hazchuyot k'neged avonot. But all of this is not weighed out by anyone. It exists only in the knowledge of the all-knowing God, for only God knows the measurements of merits against sins. Okay? So, like, phew, like that relieves me of the responsibility of judging you, right? But also, is my video all right? I just got a little pause. Everything okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It relieves me of the responsibility of judging you, but it also relieves me, to a certain extent, of the responsibility of judging myself. I don't actually know whether I'm a tzaddik or a rasha. I don't actually know if I'm a good or a bad person. That God knows that, and Maimonides seems to believe it is true. It actually works this way, that like there's a balancing act, but that's it's a mysterious balancing act. It's sort of it's beyond us. Okay. Let me just take us back though, because I don't think we're done yet with the basic proposition. And Maimonides, though he threw all this sort of, I keep calling it a scheme or a schema at us. We got the basics of how you judge a person, but look what he actually goes on to say. And this in some ways is even more difficult to figure out. So if we go back and we see that there are people whose merits exceed their sins, the tzaddikim, people whose sins exceed their merits, the rasha. There's the one who's perfectly balanced, the Benoni. And then he says, and so it is with a state, country. If the merits of all of its inhabitants exceeded their sins, it is indeed a righteous state. But if their sins exceeded, it is indeed a wicked state. And so it is with the whole world. Now, I want to know what you think about this, but let me first just ask you, let's assume it's true for a second. Do we live in a righteous state or a wicked state? I don't know. What do you think? Anyone feel confident in answering one or the other? I mean, and the way he, you know, when I think about that, I think, well, what is the history of the United, you know, but he's adding up like all of the sins of all of the people, right? It's not just like the entity of the United States. It's like the aggregate of, so I don't know. What do you think? Miriam, you were gonna.
Yeah, I think that it's an amazing statement, first of all, utterly amazing. And I think what it reminds us of is that each individual is responsible for the nature of the country that we live in. And we are not separate from that, because every country is made out of people. And so our first responsibility is to be the individual who has the merit, is more meritorious than sinful. And if we all aspire to this, then we will have a country that is also, the whole is not greater than the sum of its parts, he's saying. And
I think Miriam is exactly right. I think that's exactly right. That is what Maimonides is saying, is that it actually, since it's the aggregate of the sum of its parts, then the implication you're drawing out, I think, is exactly right, that means that what's most important is that you focus on your own behavior and you're
right.
doing good or bad. And I want to just say that's not an uncontroversial statement, right? When we think about, I don't know, what's going on in our country, would it be enough for me just to say, I don't know, like our country's complicated, but like I'm just gonna do, like I'm gonna try and be nice to the person that I see in the streets every day. Right? Or do I have to calibrate it to the state and its my participation in it, right? So that, yeah, Miriam, you're already responding.
Oh, yes, I think that that it's not about, therefore I can put my head in the sand and just be a good person. It means that our obligation as a human being goes beyond ourselves into an obligation to the country. I mean, to contribute to a society that's going to, on merit.
Okay, fair enough. But you can see how I might read it that way. So I'm curious, like how the rest of you are responding to this idea that you could say like, we have a good state, a righteous, not just good, righteous state or a wicked state, right? And how you would think about that or figure that out. Julia?
Yeah, I think building off of what Miriam is saying is not only there's a collective responsibility, but also in the not knowing, there's this sense of always needing to strive towards being better. So like you don't know if you're leaning towards bad, so you want to always be striving towards doing more good. Okay,
that's great. That's great. And that brings us finally to the Tanya that Jennifer mentioned earlier and in the chat. And now I want to give this, you maybe have seen it in the chat, but I want to just speak this out a little bit, because I think, and Julia's version of this, that these end up being points of aspiration is part of what the Tanya says as well. So the Tanya says, well, it's more complicated than that. Again, the Tanya, written in the 1700s, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, founder of the Lubavitch Hasidic movement, but also a great fan of Maimonides. And the Tanya, it sounds like a woman's name, Tanya, but his book begins with the word Tanya, it was taught. The Tanya starts with this question. And the Tanya says, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. There are 5 categories. There's a perfectly righteous person, someone who actually has done no bad. There's a tzaddik, this kind of 51% tzaddik. There's a middle person, a Benoni. There's a rasha, a wicked person, and then there's a perfectly wicked person, someone who's only, right? So he said that's the way we actually have to actually separate these into different categories. And what does that mean for him? I think he does believe that there have been perfectly righteous people in the world, but for the most part, what he says is there's a difference between the way we judge ourselves, others, the world, and when we are evaluating ourselves or being evaluated, frankly, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is what we're getting to, we have to think about the 51%, you know, that just sort of tipping over. That's how we actually, am I a good person? If I'm mostly good, I am. Am I a bad person? If I'm mostly bad, I am. I just have to, it's like, it's not really realistic. So what is the perfectly righteous and perfectly wicked person? Those are what I should be striving for. Those are my aspirations. That is what defines for me what it means to be a good or a wicked person. I can visualize that ideal, but the truth is, when I'm adding up, I'm calculating. Okay, that's all true, and I think resonates with what Julia just offered. But I want to say one other thing, which is that in the difference that he creates between the sort of the ideals and the reality of good, bad, and middle, he actually says, and it's also therefore true that in the ideal realm, right, where there's like a perfectly good person and a perfectly bad person, in that realm, the truth is, by definition, almost all of us are actually Beinonim, right? Like these middle people. In Maimonides' added up scheme, almost nobody is actually an average person, because you'd have to be 50-50. But the Tanya says the truth is almost all of us are actually just average people struggling to, you know, work this out. And he not only does he say it, it's a beautiful point. He names the subtitle of the book is Sefer HaBeinonim, the book of the average people. Right? I love that. Like this, like masterful. People would have called him a righteous person. But what he's saying is like, yeah, there are righteous people in the world, but let's focus on us, the middle people, the average people, right? So I like that. If you open the first page, you'll see it says the book of the average. It's like, it's an incredible spiritual proposition. We're all just average. Okay, great. Let's take one more hand. Yonatan, and I'm sorry I didn't call on you earlier. A little tip on just hand raising in Zoom is that when you're, this is not to, you have many reasons for being off camera, but I sometimes don't see people who are off camera. So not to say that this is a bad move, it's just sometimes I apologize if you're off camera and I don't see you, but I now see Yonatan.
Forgiven. I'm always really uncomfortable with the rabbinic obsession with righteous people, sinful people, the reward and the punishment of acts. I think it's a really vain exercise, and sometimes it's really destructive. We see some of the limits of it here in terms of like you can't really ever quantify righteousness, but also like it is never helpful to say of yourself, I'm a good person, or I am a bad person, and it's never helpful to say of someone else, that person is a good person or that person is a bad. Like there's no value to doing that, and just the rabbinic obsession with trying to do it anyways is never sat well with me.
I so deeply appreciate that comment. I think that is, I'm so glad that someone articulated it and articulated it as fully as you did, because I was hoping that voice would be one of the voices in this conversation, a voice of pushback, like, stop this. What does it even mean to say someone's good or bad, or that, oh, you add this up? And once you're in that realm, it's just, okay, fine. Maimonides said that only God knows, sort of, you know, out of the side of his mouth, say, yeah, and only God knows. But he's teaching it to us. He's having us think about this. And Yonatan's saying, like, if I may kind of embellish, like, don't give me that. You know, like, we're just complicated people trying our best. Let's focus on what it means to grow and improve, and not get obsessed with like, oh, are we bad or are we good? Or whether you're on this scale and this scale, you're sealed in this book or you're in this book. I mean, that's a lot of our language around the high holidays, and Yonatan doesn't like it. So what do you all think? Are you with Yonatan, or would anyone like to defend the schema a little bit? Yeah, Beth.
Unmute. Hi. I was thinking a couple different things about this. It's like, first of all, there's no real list. So nobody knows what's weighing, what's putting you over the 51%, what's not. And the other thing is, it also just feels, I feel like I said this last time too, it feels really Christian, like you're going to be judged, judgment day, hell, heaven. And it just feels very distilled and lacking in nuance, but yet we really don't know what the nuance is. So we're given, like, you know, Elul, these 30 days to kind of focus on these things, but there's no real list. There's just, like you were saying, it's just aspirational or not. I mean, it's just like there are these levels, and so most of us are Benanim, so we're in the middle.
So on the one hand, I think you're right. Like, how do you know? And Maimonides even says you can't really know. Although I will say, if we go further in this chapter, he's got lists aplenty. Oh, these sins are very, very bad, and these are bad. You know, like he'll give you some lists.
Right.
Wait, what was the other thing you said? I was thinking.
All right. So I didn't know of the list. It's probably a sin. That's probably a mark against me. I hope it's not.
No. But you said one other thing, and I can't remember what it was.
About the judgment, about this kind of like judgment day.
Yeah. I just was thinking while you're saying it, like, I think you'd actually be surprised at just how Jewish some of this stuff is. In other words, what this is medieval. This is medieval. And right. Christians really came to the fore in the medieval period, right? So we have a sense of them those ideas. Like, for example, I think you'd be surprised at some of the Jewish medieval writing around like sexual sin. You would think also, oh, that's very Christian. So some of this is like born of a world in which certain kind of cultural attitudes were dominant. And also there was this obsession, and I think what's common between Maimonides and, say, a Christian medievalist like Aquinas is they are trying to make sense of the mystery of religion and goodness and all that, like, and God, because they want to live in a rational world. So, you know, it may be, and it might be part of what Yonatan is saying is like, this isn't rational, formulaic, you know, but but they want it. They want a formula. I think that's fair to say about these medieval thinkers. And that ends up feeling very judgmental, because once you have a formula, it's very easy to say, like, even though he has this, like, nobody really knows, like, that's why I emphasize, like, you really have to hold on to that line. The fact is, it's like, once you have this idea in your mind, then I can just sort of look around and, oh, look, there's Joel. Is Joel mostly good or mostly bad?
Except that
you know what I mean? It's like you get into this judgmental. You're right, mostly good, Joel.
Except for two things, not I'm sure more than two, but that it says God only knows, nobody else knows. Mm-hmm. So then it also makes me think about, like, specifically religious communities or whatever they are, that they have these extreme judgments on people's sexuality and all the other things you were listing. And that in addition to that, we're given this opportunity to be reflective and to make changes and to be better and all that stuff. So it's not really just like, you're 51% out of here, you're this, you know. So it's here we have this protracted amount of time and all these, like, really these systems for doing it. So it's not really so judgy, really.
Okay, so with that in mind, actually, let's bring ourselves to the amount of time. How does this work on during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and in life in general? And I'm seeing the hands that are up. I will come back to you. But let's just take a look at, okay, Maimonides, you're telling us that this is how you might think of measuring yourself, or how you might judge yourself, or how you might be judged by God. So how does that play out? Well, Maimonides gives us two versions of it. This is in the third section here. I'm just going to skip this paragraph just for the sake of time. An interesting paragraph where he says, if you regret your good deeds, then they don't count. So that's a whole interesting discussion on its own. But then he says, okay, and even a person's merits and sins, or I should say, just as a person's merits and sins are weighed at the time of his death, so are the sins and merits of each and every one who comes into this earth. Interesting, not Jews, but each and every one who comes into this earth, weighed during the holy day of Rosh Hashanah. And this is how it works, he suggests. Right? You know, if you want to know what God's thinking. One who is found righteous is sealed for life. One who is found wicked is sealed for death. And the average person's fate is suspended until Yom Kippur. If one repents, one is sealed for life. If not, one is sealed for death. Now, I know, I mean, Beth's hackles were already up when we were talking about weighing people's, but now we're sealing people for life and death. And if you're good, you know, you're going to die this year and you have 10 days to fix it. And Yom Kippur, it's coming up, right? I know that a lot of us are probably feeling like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, now Yonatan's anxieties are really off the charts. It's like, don't tell me you know how you.
You are correct.
Yeah, right? Do you want to say more, Yonatan? With an insertion like that, I'll let you have.
Oh, I just think Maimonides is wrong.
Is wrong.
I think Maimonides is straight up wrong, and this is a terrible model.
Okay. Anyone else? Because I gotta say, I hear you, but on the other hand, like that's our books of life and death. I mean, these are what Maimonides is offering us tonight is an explanation of some of the classic themes of our liturgy. And if Yonatan is right, I think it involves a real refiguring of the entire liturgical journey through the holidays, right? Okay, let's take some responses. Allison.
So great, because I would argue against Yonatan.
Great.
And I think what actually is beneficial here about this framework, which admittedly has like some Middle Ages influence, and I understand what Yonatan is saying too, but I think there's something about having a deadline that's really helpful. And I think part of what our tradition offers us is this way of thinking about time as having a structure. And that is really helpful. You and I have had this conversation before about the repetition that comes through Jewish practice and how Jewish time is structured. And I think what this framework of judgment does kind of offer, like this idea like, oh, the gates are open only at this one time, and you've got these 10 days of awe, and make sure you get your stuff in order before this deadline. What it does is it kind of calls us to take account every year of what we've been doing. So from like a spiritual practice standpoint, I think he's actually offering us something that can be very useful if our goal is to ameliorate ourselves every year and to, you know, leave the world better than we found it.
Okay, I love this response, which is essentially a pragmatic response. Like these concepts themselves are tools actually that might be quite useful for us. So it might be unnerving, horrifying even, to think you can actually size people up and it's 51% and that person's gonna die this year, for God's sake. I mean, but on the other hand, maybe there's something really valuable. I mean, Julia was talking earlier about the idea of a righteous person as a kind of an aspiration. Well, as we aspire towards that, maybe it's good to think, well, you know, if I had to become perfectly righteous, well, I'm not doing it at all. But if I could get myself to 51%, boy, that would be something. And then to return to Tali's first comment, then maybe I would tip. Things would start to tip.
And not even just hypothetically, but if I can just tip the scales a little bit before this deadline, you know, like I think also having this kind of like, whether it's a false or manufactured urgency is also really helpful to say like, okay, just because you can't push it off indefinitely because you know the gates are going to close. Right. And so you have that apology that feels kind of awkward to give, but it's been eating at you. And you've been awake like a bunch of nights over the past 6 months because you know you didn't act well in that moment. And so maybe this way of thinking can give people the extra push that it takes to, you know, pick up the phone and call your Aunt Sarah and apologize for what you said over Passover. I don't know, whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's only so much of a spectrum in one culture, and you come out swinging against Yonatan here, but in the end, I think you're not so far away, because part of what you're saying is, yeah, sure, if you took this literally, this would be horrifying, but that's not, I don't take it literally. I think this is a sort of a symbolic language that I use here, right? Yonatan may still be saying, well, that's a terrible symbolic language, and that's where your real disagreement is. Okay, I want to turn to some people who haven't had a chance to speak yet, and I think we've called on the Jacob Wasserman box before, but I think we have a new speaker from there, right? Jacob, or is this you this time?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Beth said about sort of comparing this to Christian traditions, and I will say that, like Yonatan's point about classifying into good people and bad people and how unhelpful that is, I agree with. But what I will say is sort of, this is radical in that it doesn't presume an inclination either way. I think about like original sin, and Aquinas talked a lot about this in Christian thought at the time, that there's a sort of a fundamental damage to human nature caused by Adam and Eve eating the apple, and that every person is born bad and sort of has to really work toward good. And then the flip side of that is you're born in God's image. I'm not sure what part of Christian or religious thought that's from, but that you're fundamentally good. But Maimonides is saying you're not fundamentally either. It's all your choice. And only God knows which way you end up, but it's all your choice, which I think is, if you're gonna call people good people and bad people anyway, then at least it's comforting that, you get to choose which one you are and you're not sort of inclined fundamentally one way or the other from your birth.
Yeah, that is such a very strong point that we have sort of glazed over here so far. So thank you so much for that, Jacob, because there's something we should have said at the outset. There's something really fundamental about the whole formulation, which is that it is based on actions, on deeds. And that means it's in your, as Jacob said, it's in your control. You're not just born wicked, or like, you make yourself that way. And there is something liberating, empowering, there's something that we can do. And that's right, that's worth putting in contrast with, for example, a notion of an original sin, or just the way it is, or I'm just born this way, right? Hal or Kathy?
Yeah, it's me this time. Yeah, I'm fine with all the self-examination and all that, and thinking about these issues. But the thing that I really don't understand, I don't know, maybe this will sound kind of simplistic, but is the death part. I just don't, I've never understood how death could be seen as a punishment, because everybody dies, everything dies. If it's a punishment, then presumably somebody doesn't die, like the really, really righteous. But, that's just like, that's one of the few things that's a given, is that we're all going to die. And of course, then you can go into who dies young and who dies old, and, who deserved to die or whatever. But I think the fundamental point is that what kind of punishment is that, where everybody, that's not a punishment. Right. Even if you take it sort of metaphorically, it's a terrible metaphor.
Yeah.
Like, you should pick something that some people get it and some people don't. But it just seems like nutty to me.
Yeah.
And then if you get rid of the death as punishment thing, then the whole thing, anyway, I just have never understood.
Okay, good. I want to put that in conversation with Allison's comments earlier. And I wonder actually if Allison would revise, because I think Allison was saying that this language of being in balance can be really helpful. And we have these designated times where it's really important. This is the time to get my balance right. And that might be psychologically healthy for us to be striving in that way. But I think, Kathy really forces the question, but is it psychologically healthy for us to think we're going to die if we don't get it right? And is it psychologically helpful for us to evaluate other people's deaths in that way? Surely not every death is because they weren't righteous enough, because as Kathy says, that would be every single person in the world dies of wicked person. It's not, it can't exactly be that. And maybe that language, that part of I'm sure it's driving Yonatan crazy, but maybe that part of the language would bother even Allison, right? So,
can I
respond?
Yeah, I would say that I think part of the practice of being a practicing Jew is to read texts that are really kind of challenging. Like, we read the Parsha every week, and every week I'm challenged by the Parsha. I remember one time a couple years ago, I brought this line in the Parsha to one of my rabbi friends, and I was very upset about it. It's like saying something horrible about gay people. It's like in Leviticus. And she said to me, if you read Torah on this level, this like really pshat level, you're reading it wrong. And I think, you know, I think there's something to be said for that. Like when we say death, like, well, what does that actually mean? Is it a spiritual death? Because I think honestly, there are ways to die without dying. I think if someone, you know, I almost think of like Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah.
You know, like if you live in a way that is really out of alignment, like you create a living hell for yourself, or you can create a spiritual death for yourself.
That's great. Okay, so Allison is I admire that, doubling down on a very like straightforward proposition, which is this is all metaphorical, symbolic language that we need in order to animate us, to motivate us, to get us in that state of, you know, okay, you're not literally gonna die if you don't atone right, but like think of that as what's at stake, or spiritual death of some kind. Now, I am pretty much of your mind, Allison, so that works for me. But I also feel like we've had all this conversation about how Maimonides is trying to be a rationalist and come up with an exact system. So there's part of me that feels like you can't write him off that quickly. He seems to mean this in some, he at least. I mean, I'm not sure about how to take the Torah's language literally or not, but Maimonides, okay. I see some hands, and I hope I will have time to come back to them. But we have one last teaching, and this, I said, there's a kind of a build here, and it's this fourth paragraph that is really, this is the piece that I read to Rabbi Brous and didn't have anything particularly interesting to say about. I just thought it was so astonishing that I thought it itself is an entire sermon, and that's sort of how it reads. So let's take a look at this last piece here. Sort of out of nowhere, he says, and by the way, it feels a little bit like abrupt. He says, even though the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is simply derived from the Torah, meaning the Torah says you blow a sound on Rosh Hashanah, and that's why we do it. But there's a deeper reason. It hints at a deeper message. Kolomar, as if to say, this is what he's saying, that the shofar is really, when you listen to it, you should be thinking, wake up, you sleepers, from your sleep. Stir yourselves, you slumberers, from your slumber. Examine your conduct. Turn back in tshuva and remember your creator. That's the shofar. That's what you said. Wake up. Remember. Look at yourselves. Examine yourselves. And this is directed, he says, at those who forget the truth because of the vanities of the times, who waste all of their years in error by pursuing vanity and idleness, which are of neither benefit nor salvation. So care for your souls, improve your ways and tendencies. Let each one of you abandon your... Now, what if I had given that sermon last year at Rosh Hashanah? Would you have liked that? No, but this is, okay, so that in itself is quite dramatic. All of a sudden, he just sort of explodes with what he thinks we should be putting into our minds, but that's actually not the most interesting thing he says in this piece. The most interesting thing comes next, and I think there's something of what Julia was saying in this, and there's something of what Allison was saying in this idea of having a kind of a goal, something to look towards or aspire to in order to motivate us. Listen to the way he takes this whole formulation that we've been dealing with, the righteous and the wicked and adding up, and he turns it into a kavanah. He turns it into a kind of an intention setting. So here's what, aside from just waking up and getting yourself right, he says it is therefore necessary for every person to see themselves throughout the whole year as if they were evenly balanced between innocence and guilt, and to look upon the entire world as if it were evenly balanced between innocence and guilt. And thus, if one were to commit just one sin, one would tip the balance and bring the whole world to the side of guilt and be the cause of its destruction. But if one were to perform one mitzvah, behold, one would tip the balance for oneself and the whole world to the side of merit and bring about one's own salvation and liberation and everyone else's. As it is said, but the righteous is an everlasting foundation. Tzadik yisod ha'olam. This is the one by whose righteousness tipped the whole world to virtue and saved it. What a thing to say! What a thing to say! Now that's intention setting. Now, I'm curious what Yonatan thinks about that. I'm curious what Allison thinks. I'm curious what you all think about this idea of, okay, God only knows, or maybe you don't even like this language, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to act like you're 50-50 at every moment. And the world is 50-50 at every moment. And every next action that you take, everything in the universe depends on it. And you could change everything. And this, by the way, I must say, Chabad really takes this seriously, right? That's why they're out on the street corner, right? The connection there between the Tanya and Maimonides is clear, because every next mitzvah, okay? So I'd love to hear, just as we close, your response to that. What is this a good intention? Is this a thing that you will take into your Rosh Hashanah? I want to turn back to some hands that I saw up before. We'll take a few more before we close. Barbara, are you, this is a good, I'm catching you unawares here because you had your hand up before, but whatever you have to say, I'm sure is relevant.
Well, I don't know, but what I was going to say, and I'm always so grateful to Kathy for taking us to the heart of the matter quickly when she talks about death. The idea of being terrified in those 10 days, that something is decided. Every time I think about that, every year, I try to think about practicing my own death. Mm. You know, that there is a close. You know, there is an end, and there is a finality. And I better think long and hard about how I want to meet that. And it matters. It matters if I meet that feeling like I've done good, or if I meet that with some terrible guilt about something. And this is my chance. And I have a dog barking, so I'm going to get out of this.
Barbara, thank you. I dare say Maimonides could not have put it any more eloquently than that. Thank you so much for that. Joel.
So that's hard to follow, but yeah, I was saying, I was thinking before you mentioned about Chabad, that I've had some interaction with Chabad people in my life, and they really do follow that they believe, at least the people I've interacted with, that any mitzvah, any relatively minor mitzvah on any day of the week, it could be the one that brings the Messiah. That's the way I've heard them spin it, is that like the Messiah is going to come, and what's going to trigger it is some random mitzvah that somebody does, and we don't know. We don't know what mitzvah it's going to be. And I've seen people act like that, like every minor mitzvah is really that they do, or that they can convince you to do. It has value in itself, because that might be the one.
Yeah, that's right. Any next mitzvah.
Yeah. So
that creates a sense of urgency, right? A sense of urgency.
Yeah.
I would take one last comment, Liz.
It's feels like it's trying to inspire us with a sense of civic responsibility. It's like that every vote counts mantra. Every deed counts, and whether we see ourselves as good or evil, or the world as good or evil, our own responsibility is simply to make our own deeds count.
Yeah, it really matters. As Barbara said, it matters. It matters. And that at least, I think, and actually, I'm not sure if it, I think it's worth considering this particular intention, whether you take Maimonides at his word or see this all as symbolic language, whether this everything we've said so far works for you or not. There's a way in which suddenly he shifted and said, as if, right? Okay, this might be what Maimonides believes, it might be what some of you believe and some of you don't, but look at it for a moment as if everything's hanging in the balance. And you have no idea, the next thing you do could change everything. And it could change it for the bad, or it could change it for the good. You could be the linchpin, you could be the key to it all. And if we walked around all year, he says, but especially on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that's the energy that we want in the air. And I'll just close by giving you the last words of Maimonides here, after he says that we look at the world this way as if everything is hanging in the balance. He says, because of this, it became the custom of the whole of Israel to increase in giving tzedakah, in good deeds, in the performance of mitzvot during the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, over and above what they do during the whole year. It also became a universal custom to rise early in those 10 days to deliver in synagogues prayer of supplication and submission till the dawn of the day. And actually, I think that there's some, of course, the whole year this is good, but I think there is, Allison had to run, but I'll end by reminding us of what she offered, which is that there's some power to having a time period. There's some power to saying, you know, I should always be acting this way. But that would be crazy. I can't always be thinking that I would lose it if I was always worried about every next deed that I did. But for 10 days of the year, pretend like every single thing you do matters so much that it could cause the destruction or the salvation of the entire world. That's an intention to take into the high holidays. So we'll leave it at that. See you next week, everybody.